In Severance, employees have distinct home and work lives. Their home personas have no memories of their workday, and vice versa. The show builds tension, always feeling like something's about to explode, and at the end of season 1, it seems like everyone, including the employees in Lumon Corporation, is unhappy. The tension culminates when the macro data refinement department employees suddenly gain consciousness outside of the company. For me, I wonder whether the severance process could be legal, and if it could happen in real life. But where could the severance process be legal? If it is legal, what rights would the severed have? Hey, this is Elliott, and I'm just musing about legal issues and shows that I watch. If you're interested in that kind of thing, why don't you consider subscribing and being a part of the discussion? Severance follows Mark Scott, an employee at Lumon Industries, who undergoes a procedure called severance. A microchip is implanted into the employee's brain, separating their work memories from their non-work memories. To achieve this, the employees consent to the medical procedure that separates their memories. When they clock in and out of the office, their personas flip, and this happens through a daily elevator rise, symbolizing the transition between their work and personal life. The at-work personas, or the innies, have no recollection of their lives outside Lumon. When they're not at work, they're called outies and have no memories of their workday. This severance effectively creates separate lives for the two personas. Lumon, an old company dating back to the 19th century, is shrouded in secrecy. Its founder, Keir Egan, dominates the work culture. A canonical ebook, the Lexington Letter, provides further corporate background. How could such a situation legally occur, and if something happens to the innies, what can they actually do about it? The show's setting is in the United States. If this was real, the severance procedure would face significant legal challenges there. Medical consent issues may arise, as the innies may not be able to fully consent to the procedure. On the other hand, the corporation will argue that the innies are part of a whole and lack individual legal rights for the persona, and instead there's a contractual relationship with the person as a whole. Now, that's the United States. In more authoritarian countries with more limited individual freedoms, a corporation could potentially contract with individuals for this legal severance procedure. In countries with a more flexible or oppressed interpretation of human rights, the severance procedure might be permissible, possibly due to religious or economic efficiency outcomes. However, international human rights laws may still have some influence or limit some of these practices. Now, what about international waters like the high seas? Those are generally unregulated, but the laws of the sea, which is a body of customs, treaties, and international agreements, maintains order, productivity, and peaceful relations on the sea. Maritime countries control their water from the shore out to a distance of about 12 miles, applying their laws within this zone. Outside these limits, ships are registered under a flag state, which means they must comply with international and maritime law of the registered country in the open sea, and that can be used in various ocean conflicts. So Lumon Corporation would likely face challenges in this situation still, even if it wasn't a boat somewhere in the middle of the ocean. Now let's consider a hypothetical world where Lumon exists and it actually has severed employees. Now these severed employees could try to escape or expose the corporation for its actions, seeking public support and taking it down, and that's kind of what's happening, at least so far, as I'm working my way through season 2. But the severance program does likely raise ethical and legal concerns that violate various criminal codes, such as labor laws and criminal laws. The first issue, I think, would be unlawful experimentation on humans. The severance program's advanced beta stage, that's what it seems like to me, suggests it involves experiments or brain modifications with some limited consent. There also could be an element of coercion and undue influence. If the employees were pressured into the severance procedure or they lacked alternatives, the company could be guilty of conversion or undermining free will. The severance program also likely violates a number of employment and labor laws, treating innies essentially as slaves with limited autonomy and forcing them to work in a certain way. There's physical harm as well, and instances throughout the first season suggest assault and battery by Lumon, and that seems to continue to be the case in season 2. There's false imprisonment. Innies are confined within Lumon's facilities without legal justification, while the outies can leave. There may be some fraud elements. Lumon's misrepresentation of severance effects or withholding critical information about the procedure could constitute fraud, and the Lexington Letter suggests Lumon wasn't always that transparent during the recruitment. What about torts? Torts are civil wrongs that cause loss or harm. Now, two specific torts that came to mind when considering the plight of the innie are intentional infliction of mental distress and unlawful confinement. So intentional infliction of mental distress occurs when one intentionally or recklessly causes severe emotional distress or issues of threat of future harm. In Season 1, the innie's reaction to their circumstances highlight their unhappiness and eventually leads them to challenge the system. The innies are suffering in different ways and are often punished with a trip to the break room. Unlawful confinement, which is another civil action or tort, involves the intentional and wrongful confinement of a person without consent or lawful authority. False imprisonment is another one that would restrict a person's freedom of movement. So while these torts may be something that someone could sue for, how would the innies be treated in the system? Do they have the ability to sue? Are they considered a separate person? So legal recognition is crucial for the innies' rights and ultimately their well-being. When a government drops laws, it's generally thinking of the most effective application that will achieve whatever policy outcome that is intended for the broadest group of situations. There will always be edge cases. At some point, the legislative drafter just have to make a decision on where to draw the line and make that line as precise as possible. And the purpose for laws being drafted like this is simplicity. It's easier for a prosecutor to know whether a law has been breached, but it's also easier for someone, the general public, to know how they can avoid breaching the law in the first place. However, it's difficult for the people who draft the laws to account for everything. So there is the system of courts to grant leniency or equity in the appropriate circumstances. This would allow a judge to use his position to inject fairness and justice based on the circumstances, and a judge can consider individual facts on a case-by-case basis. For example, the judge might conclude that, based on the evidence in front of him, there might be some mitigating factors that perhaps put the situation into context and reduce the sentencing, or that there's a defense in a situation that would prevent the defendant from being found guilty in the first place. So when it comes to innies and outies, statutes in general will not treat a person in parts this way. The statute will not be drafted to make a distinction between different psyches or personas that may exist within one physical body. And again, this is because the law reflects society at large. In the grand scheme of things, there are relatively few people who have any particular disease or infliction when compared to society at large. Now, how has the law adapted in similar circumstances? Have similar facts popped up before? And how have judges treated these cases? To me, the most real-life analogy to the severance procedure would be the situation where we have a defendant who has a dissociative disorder. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders classifies this disorder as the presence of two or more distinct identities or alter states, each with its own patterns of perceiving, thinking, and relating to the environment and the self, where at least two of these identities or alter states recurrently take control of the person's behavior. Well, what does this mean? Well, disassociate means to separate or disconnect. People with dissociative identity disorder may experience several different personalities, usually referred to as alters. Each identity or alter may have different behaviors, memories, thought patterns, or expressions. Now, depending on when you may have come across this type of situation, you may have actually heard of this as multiple personality disorder, but this is what it's called today. And no, this disorder isn't caused by a medical procedure like severance. What it tends to be created through is trauma, often childhood trauma. So I do want to be very careful about how I discuss this, as I don't want to make light of people who actually have this disorder and turn it into something tangentially related to pop culture. But I think we can talk about how the law has treated this disorder in the past, as certain issues have commonly risen in many of these cases. So if one were to mount a lawsuit, the first issue one of these innies would have would be legal representation. Legal systems generally will require a lawyer to represent your interests in court, and you need to be able to give instructions to your lawyer. Now, it can be quite tricky because generally, the lawyer will be representing the whole individual and not just a part of a person, like the innie in the case of Severance. And in previous cases, some of the concern when the lawyer is dealing with different alters may be because they may actually not know if it is their client that is present. The transference between alters can be quite unpredictable for people who are not familiar with the situation. However, in the case of Severance, the transformation seems like it could be controlled quite a bit more, for instance, because they have to go through the elevator to switch between two alters. It's also clear in this case how the severance procedure is set up. The point of severance is to sever your work and home life. So I think in this fictional world, it may actually be more straightforward than in real life situations of DID, overtime contingency aside. Now, by design, the innie doesn't know anything about the outie, unlike in DID where often the host or alters share information amongst each other. There could also be steps taken by the court to confirm that the person testifying is actually the innie or the outie, such as certain questions only the innie knows how to answer. For instance, there are examples where an alter could change in the middle of testimony, Now, in the case of one civil trial, an alter system took the stand and shifted personalities throughout the trial. In another case, a defendant had 3 personalities which were sworn in separately before testifying. Now, the next question in my mind would be standing. Standing in general means that the party seeking a legal remedy must show that they have a sufficient connection and harm from the law or action to support their participation in this case. This wouldn't be a problem for a person as a whole, but in the severance case, you may very likely have a situation where the innie wants to seek a remedy, but the outie will not actually want to mount a lawsuit. From what we can tell in the show, Helena would be quite opposed to suing Lumon, despite what Helly wants. The default state for most, if not all legal systems, would be to treat a person as a single person as a whole, regardless of the existence of multiple alters. And this means that the legal rights and responsibilities belong to the individual as a whole, not to any specific alter. Most of the court decisions and research articles that I found dealt with a criminal defendant who had dissociative identity disorder, and I couldn't find any actual jurisprudence on how an individual alter would be able to mount a lawsuit. If this is indeed the case, it would be a novel issue for the court to consider. Let me know in the comments below if you do know of any. Finally, the third issue I think of is proof of harm. So assume that the innie has managed to establish legal standing and thus has the ability to sue either Lumon or its outie. In order to have a successful lawsuit, you must be able to prove that there is specific harm against the plaintiff. Again, the legal system would be challenged on how this would work, because the alter may be experiencing harm differently from the host or other alters. It's quite clear when you look at the main character's Severance. Take Hallie for instance. She got to the point where she was ready to kill herself just so that she would be able to get out of the situation that she's in. But her outie refuses to consent to Hallie being released from the system, and instead, Helena is forced to go back to the macro data refinement center. There's clearly harm here, but it'll be very difficult to prove the harm if Helena essentially refutes that she's harmed here. These are just some of the issues that I think the innies would face. Now, if the issues were so widespread and pervasive that it affected a lot of people, there are some other ways that the harm may be addressed. Perhaps a number of innies would mount some sort of class action lawsuit and band together to sue the Lumon Corporation. But that may be tricky because you're going to need a number of willing participants in this class action lawsuit, whose outie may also be defendants and thus have to testify against themselves. Alternatively, it's very possible in our society that some rights groups will go out there to attract publicity to the plight of the innie and demand legal rights for the innie. Another solution may be for these groups to advocate for change and enact legislation that would create specific rights of the innie to separate legal personhood. A separate legal personhood would have the effect to legally recognize and give rights to innies and give them the capabilities of a natural person. More stringent workplace protections could be then applied to them just because they're a separate person, or they could be introduced to give workplace rights such as minimum break times or a certain amount of time off that the protagonist in Severance didn't seem to have. In the world that we assume exists in Severance, Lumon's already gone ahead and started operating, and the severance procedure has already been implemented. So we'll take that as it is. And I think the fact of the matter is, wherever you are in the world, it's often difficult to challenge large corporations purely because of their vast resources and ability to exhaust potential plaintiffs. And this is a very real issue in real life, with the extensive amount of dollars that are put into lobbying governments to prevent change, even before anyone enters a courtroom. The issue is represented on screen in a number of ways, including through the senator in season 1 who was supporting legalizing severance. There's also that in-show punk song, F You Lumen, which shows the impact that the severance procedure has on the friends and family of the severed. This is going to be even more difficult and complicated in this case because the outie may be adverse in interest to the innie. The fact is, even if there was some ability of the innie to sue, the outie may not be a willing participant in this lawsuit, and their interests may be aligned with the corporation. There are a significant number of other issues, such as the fact that the innies may be limited in their ability to talk to each other within the corporation. This would make it difficult to coordinate a class action lawsuit, for instance. So what does this all mean? It probably means it's a good thing that the severance procedure is a fictional procedure, no matter how potentially interesting it would be just to be able to medically zone off for an entire day. If the severance procedure could actually be done, and you choose to undergo this procedure, be careful. One day you might just end up having essentially died in your sleep because your innie was so harmed while on the job that they just ended up ending their own life, thereby also ending yours. Let me know if you found this video interesting. Please do add to the conversation in the comments below, and let me know if there are any shows you think might be interesting for me to zone in on for a few moments. Thanks everyone, bye.